Okay, sorry. I thought for a moment that the broadcast had ended. Hi! I was really worried. Let's light up the darkness. All right. Who's with us? We do a little learning on a Tuesday night. Sorry, I'm so verklempt. This is such a groundbreaking day, as I'll explain momentarily. Nina's out picking up one of the kids, so I was just trying to share the broadcast into the groups that she usually shares, but I might have made a mistake. At any rate, it's an intimate group, and I'm so glad that we're together. Who is here at the outset? Paul in Chicago, Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehudit in South Carolina, Renee in Indy, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill in Berkeley, Jill in Illinois, James. I'm going to turn this on. It's really hot in this room too. Where am I? James in Indy, Nancy in North Carolina, PK in Colorado, Sharon in New Jersey. Well, I'm going to follow up on your comment in one moment. Tom in Pennsylvania, Marjorie in Georgia, Jennifer in Florida, Debbie in New Jersey, Ryan in Jacksonville, Stephen in Oklahoma, Ann in Merced, Donna in Bahama. Over there, let's see, is YouTube coming in? My rhythm is off, man. Okay. Over there on the YouTube side, Gwen is here for roll call. Yay. Marjorie in Georgia. And Lynn in North Texas. And thank you so much, Lynn. Lynn is sponsoring today's class and our learning. In honor of, this is a beautiful dedication. Lynn is sponsoring our class today in honor of enabling Torah to all of Hashem's household. What a beautiful image. The widow, the orphan, the convert, the Levite, to all Israel and to all mankind, may this labor of love, proclaiming the Torah, be judged pleasing in his sight. Amen. Beautiful dedication, Lynn. And may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we thank you for supporting our nonprofit and enabling us to light up the darkness and share Torah with the world. And we wish you all the best. Unlimited blessings, and we say amen. All right, before we continue, let me just take up this question. I know that Sharon, I asked you to restate it yesterday so that I could comment today. My comment yesterday on humility. You suggested that the Gemara was implying that we should strive to be the ideal or the model of our profession or role in life. And this seems to be contrary to the emphasis that the Torah places on humility. That is, if I properly understood your takeaway. Right. I'm saying it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen, right? That we're going to be chosen as the example of a lawyer or a teacher or a doctor, for all time. What I'm saying is, since we're never going to attain that ideal, right? That kind of perfection. Therefore, without a doubt, there's always room for growth, right? So my idea was simply, could we try to become better and better and better at what we do? Not only the skill set of doing our professions, but to do it in a righteous manner, so that imagine that they would look back on us and. Imagine if all the records of mankind were somehow destroyed, but somehow what was left over was a record of us and who we are, and we would have to stand up, for our community, for our city, for our nation, even God forbid, for humanity. Could we at least make a decent showing for ourselves, right? We as if we were being examined, as if we were being held up as an example, not out of I'm so great and arrogant, but simply could I somehow bring myself closer to that ideal in case I was being examined. And we should view ourselves that way all the time, because perhaps, our descendants won't examine the minutiae of our lives. Perhaps, the way we do things won't be studied by students for many, many centuries, like these particular officials who served in the temple. But we do know, it's a firm teaching of the tradition, that everybody's deeds, all our deeds, are recorded in a book, and the Holy One does examine those books. So please God, strengthen me to live a more righteous life so that when my books are examined, at least I'll come out that more than half of, the 51% of what I do is okay and, outweighs whatever the other 49% is. All right. We definitely have an interesting page today. We're continuing. We're here in Daf Yud Dalet, page 14 of Tractate Shekalim, the 5th volume of the Talmud. We're examining the procedures of the temple and really getting some insight of what it was like to work there, to bring offerings there, to do business with the temple, like that day-to-day, what it felt like to be at the temple. Is really coming through in this tractate, and it's a great experience as we dive in. Here in this chapter, we're in chapter 4, right? Chapter 5. We've started chapter 5. And here we're talking about certain officials who worked in the temple in one of the generations. I mean, there were many, many, many generations of officials who served in the temple. But some have been singled out, and it's a little unclear, were they the best that ever were at what they do? Were they the most righteous people who ever served in that position? Did they actually do something wrong, and that's why they're being remembered? Or were they simply the ones who were there in the generation where the Tana of our Mishna happened to list the various positions, and so as an example, he named the people who had that position in his time, in his day? Unclear, we're not sure, but as we examine these officials and their duties, we're definitely getting some insight into the workings of the temple. So let's get going. We're definitely going to encounter some interesting stuff today. All right, here we go. The Mishnah, so we're examining the first Mishnah here in chapter 5, this list of officials who serve there. And so here at the bottom of page 13, the Mishnah states that Ben Akiva was appointed to treat those priests who suffered from intestinal disease. And the Gemara explains, let me turn that off. And the Gemara explains why priests were particularly susceptible to this ailment, since the priests would walk barefoot on the floor. Like, did you have that? If you weren't told that, would you have ever thought that the priests serve barefoot in the temple, in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem? And they must. It's part of their calling, primarily because the Torah says these are the 4 garments that they will wear, and it doesn't say anything about shoes, and so shoes are not part of the priestly garb. Moreover, if their feet are not in contact with the floor of the temple, their avoda, their service to the divine is actually disqualified. So when they're bringing offerings, when they're doing any of the divine, the work of the divine in the Holy Temple, they must be barefoot. Now, if you've been in Jerusalem in November, December, January, February, it's cold. It can even snow in Jerusalem. We've seen a video in the last couple of years of snow in Jerusalem. So this was not an easy job to serve on the Temple Mount barefoot. They were exposed to the elements, as it were. And again, they could only wear those certain specific garments, even in the winter when they were doing the divine service. So it's like they'd run out, they'd do what they needed to do, they'd bring it on the altar, and then presumably they would get back inside where there was a nice roaring blaze and warm up again. But nevertheless, this constant exposure, hot, cold, in the winter, took a toll on the priests. Moreover, they would eat a lot of meat, because it was their job to eat parts of certain offerings, and they would drink a lot of water. And according to the Gemara, if you eat a lot of meat, drink a lot of water, and expose yourself to the cold, you will contract intestinal disease. And Ben Akiva knew how to treat them because he knew that this particular type of wine was good for healing the intestines, and that particular type of wine was effective as intestinal medicine. So he was a guy who knew the secrets of wine as medicine. The Mishna states that Nehunya was the well digger. And the Gemara explains that he would dig wells and caves where rainwater would collect for pilgrims to use on their way to Jerusalem for the festivals, like the Passover festival we just had. That was one of the pilgrimage festivals. And people would flow up to Jerusalem, thousands and thousands of them, and they needed water. So he created these wells and cisterns so that the pilgrims would have water to drink. And he knew which rock contains water and which rock contains fissures in which water may be found and how far those fissures extend. And this would enable him to calculate how deep he had to dig to reach water. And Rabbi Eliezer said, and his son died of thirst. Now, this is just like a little aside. And it's like, oh, this is so terrible. I mean, this is a guy who's so righteous. He's serving in the temple. He's known as the well digger who would provide water for all the pilgrims. And his son died of thirst. And we have an interesting note about that from Rav Steinsaltz. There's a similar incident that's reported at length in Bava Kama, so Tractate Bava Kama, which we'll encounter in a few years in our journey through the Babylonian Talmud. And in Bava Kama, there's a story about another child of this same Nehunya, the well digger, who fell, and she fell into a great water pit. And people came and notified Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. And after 1 hour, Rabbi Hanina said to them, she's okay, don't worry. And after 2 hours, he told them, she is still at peace. No need to worry. And after 3 hours, he declared, she has ascended from the pit. She is safe. And later they asked her, who pulled you up? And she replied that a ram happened by, led by a certain elderly man. And the Gemara adds that they asked Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa whether he was a prophet, as how could he accurately report on the girl from so far away? And he replied, I'm neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I simply reasoned that the offspring of that righteous man, Nehunya the well digger, could not possibly come to harm through the very object over which he takes so much trouble for the public benefit. He creates water pits. He creates water cistern. And he's a righteous man. And Rabbi Hanina just refused to believe that his daughter would fall into one of those, such a pit, and drown in. He just refused to believe it. And she was saved. So the obvious question is, why his merit, the merit of Nehunya, was not able to save his son from dying of thirst, which seems to be related here in our Gemara, here in Tractate Shekalim. And Rabbi, so some explain that Rabbi Hanina's logical reasoning actually included a prayer to God on behalf of the girl, and it was his prayer that saved the girl, not just his logical reasoning. Hold on a second. However, no one prayed, but there was no one around to pray for Rabbi Nehunya's son when he was dying of thirst. Presumably he was lost in the desert, and that is how he died, when he died of thirst. And since God is exacting with the righteous, that misfortune came upon him. Others maintain that the two incidents are not precisely the same, as pits, which are the very objects that Nehunya dug, could never cause his offspring harm, whereas dehydration, he gave water to drink for the pilgrims coming up to Jerusalem, but it's not like they were dying of dehydration. And the fact that his son died of thirst, it's like, same ballpark, but not the same play. As it were, is how some people explain the difference in those two outcomes. I just wanted to comment on that one little phrase that Rav Steinsaltz used, since God is exacting with the righteous. Right? And this carries with it this idea that often extremely righteous individuals who've done nothing wrong have terrible sufferings in their life. Right? Just as we also see that the wicked can prosper. But one stream of thought about this in our tradition is that people who are so righteous, they're destined for such a high place in the world to come. And whatever sufferings we have in this world, I mean, our lives here are so brief, like an incandescent spark, compared to the life of eternity, right? Where we are souls, we are eternal beings. We come from a world of eternity. We return to a world of eternity. In this very brief life here, we learn as much as we can, and we take the merit of our learning and our deeds. That's all we can take with us to the next world. But these sufferings that certain righteous people have in this world, it's almost like, it's called the afflictions of love elsewhere in the Talmud. And the idea is that God allows such people to suffer in this world because for them, that's it. Whatever they suffered in this world is the end of their suffering. Whereas for the rest of us, we have a ledger, we have a lot of good deeds, we have a lot of bad deeds. We're going to be rewarded for all the good deeds, but we have to pay, we have to account for all of our misdeeds. And very often where that happens is in Gehenna, a kind of temporary place of suffering and refinement where we go. It's like a purgatory when we leave this life. But the righteous who suffer in this world bypass Gehenna. They go straight to their reward in the world to come. And so we get that from this idea of that God is exacting with the righteous. Let's continue. The Gemara cites a related story now that we're talking about some of these people who served in the temple. Hold on. Here we go. Okay, so Rabbi Haggai said in the name of Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman that there was an incident involving a certain pious man who would dig pits, wells, and caves to collect water for passers-by. Once his daughter was passing over a river for the purpose of marriage, and the river washed her away, and all the people came to console him, but he refused to accept their condolences. It's a similar story to the Nehunya story. Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair came to visit him to console him, but he refused to accept condolences even from Rabbi Pinchas. Remember, Rabbi Pinchas was the one who's so righteous that even his donkey was wise enough to distinguish between tithed and untithed produce. This was like the leading sage of the generation, and this man who they told him that his daughter had drowned in the river, he refused to accept condolences, meaning he refused to accept that she was dead, or if she was dead, to be comforted. So Rabbi Pinchas Yair came to visit him to console him, but he refused to accept condolences even from Rabbi Pinchas. Rabbi Pinchas said to the people of that community who had brought him to see this man, "Is this your righteous man who will not be consoled and accept God's judgment?" Right? Rabbi Pinchas was saying, listen, I mean, if she's dead, she's dead. And a truly righteous person is going to accept these things. I mean, it's terrible. You're going to mourn. You're going to grieve. No one's telling you not to, losing a child. There is no greater grief, period. There's nothing more terrible that can happen to a person. But you accept that it happened, that God had a reason, right? So I guess Rabbi Pinchas is saying if he's refusing to be consoled, it's like he's saying that God was wrong to take his daughter. They said to him, "Rabbi, he would perform such and such acts of righteousness by supplying water," right? This is a person who, he wasn't paid to do this work. He was just a truly righteous person who was always out there digging wells so that people passing by would have water to drink. And yet, such and such tragedy, the drowning of his daughter, occurred to him. Rabbi Pinchas said, "Is it possible that he honors his creator with water, and yet his creator strikes him with water?" Right? It's possible that even a righteous person like this would have a child die. Of course, that's possible. But Rabbi Pinchas reasoned, but if God wouldn't take his daughter through the very act of his righteousness, the wells that he digs, he wouldn't use water to drown her. So maybe she didn't drown. Immediately thereafter, a report spread throughout the city. The daughter of that righteous man has arrived. She did not drown. It seemed like the river swept her away, but she survived. Some say she grasped a branch and pulled herself out of the river, and some say an angel in the form of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair descended from heaven and rescued her. But the point is that for such a righteous man like that, maybe he could suffer that unbearable tragedy of losing a child, but it wouldn't happen to him through the very righteous deeds that he's involved in. The Mishna states that Givini, another one of these officials who served in the temple, he was the temple crier. The Gemara cites a baraisa that states that Givini would issue an announcement every morning in the temple. What would he say? I want to I'm pronouncing his name right. Givini. He would issue an announcement every morning in the temple. What would he say in his announcement? "Arise, priests, to service, and Levites to their platform to sing, and Israelites to their watch." There were always certain Israelites serving in the temple. who had the role of representing the rest of the nation for certain communal sacrifices. And Gavini's voice was so powerful that King Agrippa once heard his voice as far away as 8 parasangs. That's like 36 kilometers away. So this Gavina really had a voice that carried. And Agrippa gave him many gifts as a sign of his appreciation. By the way, this King Agrippa, interesting character, he was the grandson of King Herod. Herod, his name is quite familiar to you if you've taken any kind of a trip to Israel and seen some of the tourist sites around Jerusalem, because Herod was a builder, right? He was not a descendant of King David. In fact, he was a descendant of a slave family that usurped the throne and really served at the pleasure of the Roman government. But he built up the temple. He made it much more grand than the second temple had been before him. And there are still structures left over that King Herod built. But he was not a righteous person. He was a very self-aggrandizing person. His grandson, Agrippa, was raised in the court among the nobility of Rome, in Rome. And when it came time for him to assume the throne of Israel, again, not a godly appointed king, but one serving at the pleasure of Rome, nevertheless, he had some kind of a spiritual awakening, and he deferred in all sort of matters of faith to the sages of Jerusalem. And so the sages had a lot of respect and a good relationship with King Agrippa. Skipping down a little further, the Mishna states that Ben Bevi was responsible for the shreds of garments, and the Gemara explains that he would braid shreds together to prepare wicks for the menorah, right? So the garments of the priests, when they would wear out, he would shred them and turn them into wicks that would sit in the little bowls of oil on the 7-branch candelabrum. That's the symbol of the state of Israel today, that 7-branched menorah. Not like the Hanukkah, the 9-branched Hanukkah that we light up at Hanukkah, but the symbol that was in the tabernacle in the wilderness, and then again in the temple in Jerusalem, was the hammered gold menorah, or candelabrum in English. It was lit with oil, and so each bowl at the top contained a certain measure of very pure, very high-grade oil, and then there was a wick inside it, like any oil lamp needs a wick, and the wicks of the candelabrum were made from scraps, from shreds of the worn-out garb of the priests, because those clothes were so invested with holiness, you couldn't, after they wear out, they can no longer be worn by the priests. If it's patched or has holes or is threadbare, it's beneath the dignity of the office of a priest in Jerusalem. But they couldn't just throw it in the trash. It would have to be burned, but so much better to burn it as a wick in the light and literally light up the darkness throughout the world, right? The light that shines forth from Jerusalem comes from that candelabrum in the temple. So this Ben Bevi was the one in charge of the shreds and the wicks. And the Gemara relates that Rabbi Yosei came to the town of Kufra and wanted to appoint leaders for them to care for the needs of the community and the provisions of the poor. However, those who were selected would not accept the appointment from them, i.e. from Rabbi Yosei, because they deemed this job beneath their dignity. So this Rabbi Yosei traveled to another town from the one he lived, and he said, okay, there's a lot of poor people here. There's also rich people here. Who are, you're going to be making sure that you're giving tzedakah, that you're going to be giving charity to provide for the poor. Now, somebody needs to distribute that charity to the poor, and he chose, a couple of guys, and he said, okay, you're the ones. You're going to be the distributors of charity to the poor. It's a very important office, and I want you to do it and do it righteously. And these guys said, listen, we're very busy. We're important businessmen. We're not going to walk around giving money to the poor. Ask somebody else. Rabbi Yosei came and said to them, Ben Bevi was responsible for the lowly function of shredding the worn-out garments of the priests. And if this man who was appointed to deal with the shreds of garments and turning them into wicks to be used to wicks to be used in oil lamps, merited to be listed with the greatest of that generation. You, who are appointed to a life-saving mission, right? You're going to be distributing charity to the hungry. Like, that's a life-sustaining mission. You're going to tell me that this is beneath your dignity? Ben Bevi, who's listed among the most righteous of his generation, is just dealing with old clothes and wicks. And you, who have a life-sustaining mission, you're telling me you're too busy? And presumably, Rabbi Yosei's argument won the day. The Mishnah further taught, I'm going to skip that. Skipping down a little more. The Mishnah mentioned the house of Gamru, who was responsible for the preparation of the shewbread, right? So there was unleavened bread, and recall that unleavened bread, matzah, in the ancient world was always soft, much more similar to like a lavush. Lavush, is that kind of bread? Almost like a tortilla, right? It's like a soft bread, unleavened, a soft unleavened bread. But the shewbreads that were on the specific table for the shewbreads in the temple, in the courtyard, were very large, right? So it was a large unleavened. It was unleavened, but it was thick, right? As we discussed this some months ago. So it's these very large unleavened breads that were folded over, and there were 12 of them on that table. And during the first temple period, that one of the 10 ongoing miracles of the temple is that those showbreads would always remain as fresh and smell as nice as when they first came out of the oven. The whole week that they were on the table, they would be replaced every Shabbos, and then the next Shabbos they would come off. And the priests, it was one of their perks that they would eat the shewbread that came off the table. So this was a very, very high-end bread baked to very exacting specifications. And there was a family, the house of Gamru, who was responsible for the preparation of the shewbread. The Gemara relates a story from a Baraisa about the house of Gamru and their talent in baking. The house of Gamru was proficient in the preparation of the shewbread and its removal from the oven without ruining it. But they did not want to teach these skills to others. And so now the Gemara will relate this story, and we'll see that there's a bit of a back and forth. And the Gemara is sort of speculating, and the sages were wondering and argued about, why did this family not want to share its secret? The initial judgment is negative. Like, they didn't want to share their secret because they wanted to always have a monopoly on the gig of baking and selling, being paid to provide the shewbread in the temple. And they didn't want to share that knowledge with anybody else. And so it was a selfish reason that they wouldn't share that information. But as we'll see, it may be that they actually had a much higher purpose, a holy purpose, in not sharing that information. So they didn't want to share that. They didn't want to teach these skills to others. Therefore, the sages sent messengers and brought in craftsmen from Alexandria, who were also proficient in the preparation of the shewbread, in an attempt to replace the house of Gamru. However, the craftsmen from Alexandria were not as proficient as the house of Gamru. And the complex form of the shewbread rendered it very difficult to remove the bread from the oven without breaking it, because these are very large and heavy breads, and when they would take them out of the oven, they would always break or crack, and they couldn't do it with the perfection of the house of Gamru. And the Gemara clarifies the difference between the two manners of preparation. The house of Gamru would ignite the fire within the oven, bake the bread in a mold, and remove the bread from the mold only outside the oven, after they took the mold out of the oven, after it was fully baked. And as they would remove it from the mold at this late stage, it would not spoil. Whereas those Egyptian craftsmen, they're Jews. Remember, there was a big Jewish community in Alexandria. This is more than 1,000 years after the Exodus. These Egyptian craftsmen, these Jews from Alexandria in Egypt, would ignite the fire within the oven and bake the shewbread in the mold, but out of fear that it would break when they removed it from the mold, they would remove it from the mold inside the oven before it was fully baked, and the result was that the bread would spoil. They were able to remove it without cracking it, but then it wouldn't last all week like the bread of the house of Gamru. Once the sages realized this matter, that their replacement shewbread was flawed, they said, everything that the Holy One, blessed be he created for his glory. As it is stated, Proverbs 16:4, the Lord has made everything for his own purpose. Since spoiled shewbread does not promote the glory of God, we must forego our honor, the sages who thought to replace the house of Gamru, and request the services of the house of Gamru once again. They had to go, tail between their legs back to the house of Gamru and say, well, we tried to replace you since you wouldn't share that information and we were unsuccessful. The people we brought in are not as good as you and we want you back. The sages, they went to the sages sent for the house of Gamru, but the house of Gamru was insulted. They did not want to come back to bake until the sages doubled their compensation. They had been receiving 12 manna, and now they gave them 24. And Rabbi Yehuda says they had been receiving 24 manna, and now they gave them 48. Part of the conflict also was they had been receiving the same wage for centuries. And you can imagine that there was some, movement of prices over time. And so maybe the payment that they were getting, they said, we need a raise. You're not paying us appropriately. Maybe the sages said, we'll find somebody else. And in the end, they couldn't find somebody else as good. And they had to double the wages that the house of Gamru had been getting before. The sages then said to them, what is the reason that you don't want to teach the art of shewbread baking to others? Right? They had assumed it was just like because they were being selfish. They didn't want to share that honor and that income with other people. But now they actually asked them. And the house of Gamru answered, we have a tradition from our fathers that this house, meaning the house of the Lord, that's the holy temple, will be destroyed. We do not want to teach our method so that others should not learn this art and then use this, sort of like unique method of baking bread, which has only been used in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. We don't want it to be used to bake bread to serve idols in houses of idolatry. We don't want our techniques to be used, for serving idols and paganism, etc., other religions. This is only for God. Although their reason for refraining from teaching their method to others was not accepted, on this other matter, the sages did mention them with praise. That refined bread was never found in their children's possession at all, so that people should not say that they feast upon their shewbread labor. So even though they knew how to make the finest bread in the world, they only did so for the table of shewbread in the temple. They never baked that kind of bread to eat in their own homes. And the sages praised them for that. A similar story is then told about the house of Avtinas. The house of Avtinas. This was the family that had the monopoly on fabricating the incense that was burned on the incense altar in the temple. And basically the story is exactly the same, that the sages thought, to ask them to share their knowledge. They wouldn't do it. The negotiations broke down. They thought to bring in other people to compound the incense burned in the temple. They brought craftsmen from Alexandria who were famous for being amazing craftsmen in creating incense. And they were able to follow the recipe as it's stated in the Torah of what elements need to be in the incense. And apparently it smelled correct, but when they would burn the incense of the Alexandrians in the temple, it would not rise like a column of smoke, a beautiful straight column of smoke, like the incense of the house of Avtinas. Rather, the smoke would just kind of spread out all over the place, and it did not inure to the honor of God in the same way as the incense created by the house of Avtinas. So the sages admitted that they were wrong. They sent the Alexandrians away. They went back to the house of Avtinas, and they ended up having to double their wages. And then the sages asked the house of Avtinas the same question. For what reason don't you want to teach the art of incense preparation to others? And the house of Avtinas said the same thing. We have a tradition from our fathers that this house, the temple will eventually be destroyed. And we do not want to teach our method so that others should not learn these skills and prepare this incense for their idolatry. And although their reason for refraining from teaching their method to others was not accepted, on these matters the sages did mention the house of Avtinas with praise, that never did the wife of any one of them leave her house perfumed. Right? They compound the finest incense in the world. Is obviously the same kind of skill set as creating perfume. And not only that, but when one of them would marry a woman from elsewhere, he would stipulate with her before their marriage that their marriage was on the condition that she may never perfume herself all the days of her life, so that people should not ever have the chance to say that the members of the house of Avtinas perfumed themselves from the preparation of the incense used in the temple. And they did so to fulfill that which is stated, then you shall be clear before the Lord and before Israel. So there's that old saying that the shoemaker's kid has no shoes, right? Because it's almost like, the shoemaker's so busy working for others that he doesn't have time or doesn't even have money to, well, he has the means, he can make shoes, and somehow he doesn't get around to making shoes for his kid. But in the case of the house of Avtinas, it was, they sort of make the perfume, as it were, the beautiful, beautiful, fragrant incense that is burned in the temple for the nation. And anybody who marries into that house has to know that they are giving up the use of perfume for the rest of their lives because they were so exacting with themselves that no one should ever have cause for suspicion that they use some of that incense for their own purposes in their homes. Rabbi Akiva said, Shimon ben Loga told me, once I and a certain child from the house of Avtinas were collecting herbs, and I saw him crying, and later I saw him laughing, and I said to him, my son, why did you cry? And he said to me, I cry for the glory of my father's house, which has been diminished after the destruction of the temple, right? So this is after the second temple was destroyed. Okay, so now the house of Avtinas would never make incense again. Right? They only were making incense when there was a temple to burn it in. Once the temple was destroyed, no more offerings were brought, not in 2,000 years since it's been destroyed. We haven't brought offerings, and that includes we haven't burned the incense of the daily offering of the incense, nor at Yom Kippur, which was only done in the temple. So therefore, the house of Avtinas no longer had the honor of providing the incense to the temple on behalf of the nation. And so this boy from the house of Avtinas was crying because of the diminishment of the honor of their family. But then he also laughed, right? So Shimon ben Loga said to him, why did you laugh? And he said to me, I laugh with joy over the glory prepared for the righteous in the future, when my family will have its role restored to them in the rebuilt temple. And the idea here is they had a prophecy in both of these families, in Gamru regarding the shewbread baking and in Avtinas regarding the making the incense. Both of them had a prophecy within their households that the temple would be destroyed. While the temple stood, it was not really thinkable to the population that the temple would someday be destroyed. Prophets came and told them that the nation is so filled with sin that the nation is going to fall and the temple will be destroyed. But no one listened to the prophets, right? No one listened to Jeremiah. No one listened to Isaiah. And eventually the first temple was destroyed, and then eventually the second temple was destroyed also. But just as the prophecy that the temple would be destroyed was fulfilled, so too, apparently, there's at least a tradition, if not a prophecy, within those households that the temple will be rebuilt. And when it is rebuilt, the descendants of the house of Gamru and the house of Avtinas will be called back to do the family business, as it were, making the shewbread and the incense. Now, I'm not aware of any people alive today who know that they are descended from these households. Maybe there are. I haven't looked up the question. I'd be fascinated if there are people who actually know that they're descended from those families. At this point, however, there's probably, so many of them. If indeed the family survived and grew like families grow, and maybe there's a lot of people who are descendants and don't know that they are descendants, but when Mashiach comes, so much will be revealed to us when the knowledge of God fills the world the way that the water fills the sea. Presumably, people will know which tribe they're a part of, if they don't already, and which families they're descended from, if they don't know already. That kind of knowledge will become available when Mashiach comes. That kind of knowledge will become available. I got that from Rabbi Wolf, not specifically on that question, but like everything will be revealed. So why wouldn't that be revealed? We'll understand the nature of our suffering over these many, many centuries. And if we're going to understand that, why wouldn't we understand who we are and where we came from and what our lineage is? Where am I? Okay. Similarly, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, once I and a certain elderly man were collecting herbs. I encountered a certain elderly man from the house of Avtinas with a scroll in his hand with instructions on how to identify herbs for the temple incense and how to prepare it. And that elderly man said to me, Rabbi, in the past, members of my father's house were discreet and cautious, and they would transfer this scroll only to one another, the secret recipe of the incense within the house of Avtinas, so that it would not come into the possession of anyone who might misuse its information. And now that the members of my father's house are not reliable, I am concerned that they might pass the scroll to the wrong person. I will not give it to one of them, but only to someone whom I judge to be completely trustworthy. Therefore, here it is for you, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, as I can trust you to take the scroll and be careful with it. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri continued, and when I came and recounted these matters to Rabbi Akiva, his eyes shed tears. And he said, from now on, we should not mention the members of the house of Avtinas unfavorably, right? They had been unfavorable. The sages had described that unfavorably for keeping the secrets to themselves, presumably because they want to keep a monopoly on that business. But now that we see why they were being so careful with the secret, and when they no longer trusted their own house, then this man entrusted, a real fine representative of that family would rather entrust the secret recipe to one of the sages than to a member of his own family. Now Rabbi Akiva says, we see that we were wrong about them, and this truly is a magnificent and honorable family. That's the end of our discussion of the first Mishnah here in chapter 5. Now the second Mishnah in chapter 5. There must be no fewer than 7 trustees and 3 treasurers over the temple administration. And we do not appoint an authority over the public comprised of fewer than 2 people, except for Ben Achia, who treated the priests that suffer from intestinal disease, and Elazar, who is responsible for the weaving of the temple curtains. All the other offices have to be manned by at least 2 people so that they can have a system of checks and balances. They can, make sure nothing gets used waywardly. And the reason for these exceptions in the case of Achia and Elazar is that the majority of the public accepted these men upon themselves as officials who served without the assistance of even a single partner. In other words, they were so highly respected and trusted that they didn't need to have somebody looking over their shoulder in their office. That's the Mishnah. Skipping down a little bit in the Gemara discussing that Mishnah. The Mishnah states that we do not appoint an authority over the public in monetary matters comprised of fewer than 2 people. Rav Nachman said in the name of Rabbi Mana, and this principle is derived on the basis of a verse that is referring to those engaged in building the tabernacle and weaving the priestly vestments, who receive the community's donations. And they shall take the gold and the sky blue wool and the purple wool. Exodus 28:5. And it says, and they shall take. And the plural they indicates that this authority must consist of at least 2 people. It's a good common sense ruling by the sages, right? That in money matters, money belonging to the public, charities, public office, government, etc., anybody who's in charge of dispersing money, there's got to be at least 2 people there who can keep watch on each other, if not a bunch more. Rabbi Chama, the son of Rabbi Hanina, said, although Moses supervised the building of the tabernacle, he took nothing for himself from the community donations. Right? Moses, at all times, throughout the whole 40 years of taking the people out of Egypt and then wandering in the desert, right? He was working 24 hours a day as being the leader, and it wore on him. It was an exhausting job leading 2 million Jews camping in the desert, as you can imagine. He could have said, okay, I'm happy to serve. God picked me. I'll do whatever God says. I'll be here for the people. But, I need a living wage. Even the president of the United States gets a salary, right? He could get a salary, but he never took anything from the community donations as payment for himself. However, Moses was a rich man. He did grow wealthy. And from what? From something that God gave him directly. And what was that? Moses grew wealthy. There's a midrash that we have. From the shavings that broke off during the chiseling process of the second tablets. Recall that the first tablets of the 10 Commandments were made by God. He carved out the tablets and inscribed them. Those were, Moses cast them down at the incident of the golden calf. And then a second set of tablets were made to bear the 10 Commandments. And the second set were more of a partnership between man and God. Moses carved them out, carved the tablets, and God inscribed them. But the leftovers of the material that the tablets were inscribed from, and some say they were blue sapphire, but whatever that material was, just the shake, the bits of stone that fell away from the carving process was enough to enrich Moses for the rest of his life. And this is as it is written, hew for yourself 2 tablets of stones, right? Hew for yourself, carve for yourself. Why did God say that? He could have just said carve 2 tablets of stone. So from this carve for yourself in Exodus 34:1 indicates that the shavings shall be yours, shall belong to Moses. And Rabbi Hanin said, the Holy One, blessed be he, created a quarry of precious stones and pearls for Moses inside his tent, and Moses grew wealthy from that source. It's almost like, okay, he was wealthy, so what? It's not like he ever took a vacation. He lived in a tent along with everybody else. He didn't sort of take his wealth into the Holy Land with him. Maybe it got passed down to his children. He had 2 sons, and presumably it went to them, to his heirs, and so at least they could enjoy that. But why was it important that Moses was wealthy? It's like the last thing we think about. What difference does it make if Moses is wealthy? He's the greatest prophet of all time. Why should it matter that he's wealthy? Why should that even be remembered or recorded? And it is written, it came to pass when Moses went out to the tent, that all the people rose up and stood, every man at his tent door, and looked after Moses until he had gone into the tent. That's Exodus 33:8. And there were 2 rabbis of the Talmud who interpreted this verse with regard to Moses' wealth. But they interpreted it in opposite ways. One of them said, the people looked at Moses unfavorably, like they were jealous of him because he was wealthy. They didn't like that he was wealthy. While the other said the people looked at Moses favorably. And he who said that the people looked at Moses unfavorably maintains that they said, look at his legs, look at his feet, look at his flesh, see how healthy they are. All that he eats comes from us Jews, and all that he drinks comes from us Jews, and all of his assets are taken from us. This is sort of like Korach might have said that. Korach, who really was one of the richest people who ever lived because he took so much wealth out of Egypt, but it wasn't enough for him, and he ended up being buried alive when he tried to lead a rebellion against Moses. And the one who said that the people looked at Moses favorably maintains that the people were not responding to Moses' wealth, but simply wanted to see the righteous man, saying, we desire to view the righteous, and one who merits to view Moses earns great rewards. Right? We have a tradition that when you see a righteous person, it's a blessing to you. To meet a tzaddik, a truly righteous person, is such a blessing for you. It's a merit. You're so fortunate that you live to meet a righteous person in person. And that's what the people wanted to see Moses. But this discussion of why Moses would be wealthy, it goes to another tradition that we have that, and where's the source of it? Hold on. The idea is derived from the, the commentaries wonder, Moses grew wealthy. The reason it is necessary for a prophet to be rich is to ensure that he will have influence on people and will not be ignored. As King Solomon stated, Ecclesiastes 9:16, the poor man's wisdom is despised and his words are not heard. This is a sad, tragic, but entirely predictable aspect of human nature, that we give a lot of respect and want to hear the words of rich people and usually kind of ignore and blow off and don't listen to poor people. And we think, well, why is he so poor? If he was so bright and had so much things to say that we should listen to, he wouldn't be so poor. But somebody who's super rich and powerful and has influence in this world, well, we want to hear what that person has to say. It's just human nature, right? Money is no indicator of wisdom, as we well know, but it's human nature that we pay attention more to the wealthy. And so we have a tradition that all the prophets were wealthy men, right? And was it their prophecy that made them wealthy? Usually not, but that God chose prophets from among the wealthy. Or, there's a lot of traditions that say that prophets, it wasn't like just somebody minding his own business, living out his life, and suddenly God chose him to become a prophet. But there were actually a lot of people who pursued prophecy. They went to schools of prophecy. They kind of became, they indentured themselves as apprentices to prophets and tried, to aspire to become prophets. Who had the time, the leisure, the opportunity to pursue the vocation of prophecy? The rich, the idle rich who weren't concerned with making a living. And so that may be another aspect of it, but we have a tradition that the prophets were actually wealthy people, whether because they had the time to pursue prophecy because they were rich, or because of this idea, quoting Solomon, that the nature of people is to pay more attention to the wealthy. Sad, but true. And now we're briefly, I'm at the end, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. We're going to open our discussion of the third Mishna here in chapter 5. And it's actually a long Mishnah, so rather than read the whole thing, I'm just going to read you the halacha, which basically, this Mishnah is the law, and it restates it just a little bit more briefly. There were 4 seals in the temple, seals like that used as a stamp. We already talked about this a little bit, that when a pilgrim would come to bring an offering, he might bring the animal, but he also needed libations to accompany the offering, the sacrifice, wine, oil, fine flour, depending on the type of offering, and he would usually buy that in the temple. The temple sold those things, and the way he would do it is he would go to the sort of the cashier in the treasury and pay his money there. That money then became consecrated, part of the temple treasury. They would give him a seal, like a token, and he would take it to this other place where he would hand over the token and pick up whatever it is that he had paid for, wine, oil, fine flour, etc. And any individual who brought a private offering to the temple would pay the libation fees to the official responsible for the seals. The official would give him the appropriate seal, token, for his offering. For example, if he brought offerings of a rich leper, the official would give him a seal on which was written, sinner. Meaning, in other words, there were 4 types of tokens, or they're called seals, which would signal at the place where the libations are handed out which one you needed. And they were labeled sort of like the kind of standardized offerings. So a leper, again, not leprosy the way we understand it, but ra'as, this physical manifestation of a spiritual malady. And when you are cured of that, when God cures you of that, and then you go through your purification process so that you can re-enter society, as it were, part of that process is bringing offerings, and you have to bring these offerings. So you bring the offerings of the leper, but they're actually they're the same as the offerings of a sin. You bring a sin offering. And so you get this token that says sinner on it. Doesn't mean you're a sinner. It means you're getting the libations of the sin offering. And he would take that seal to the official responsible for the libations, who would give him the corresponding libations. Every evening, these two officials, the one who sold the tokens and the one who collected the tokens, would meet and compare the number of seals with the total amount of money. If there was a surplus of money, it was used for the benefit of the temple treasury of consecrated property. If money was missing, the official responsible for the seals would pay the difference to the temple treasury from his own pocket. As we've seen over and over again, the temple always wins because you're protecting people from coming to misappropriate consecrated property. You might think that's a scam that the officials who run the temple run on the pilgrims who are coming there, or the vendors who are selling products to the temple, or the artisans who are doing work for the temple, that they always lose by a little bit. But as we see, the officials who run the temple are treated exactly the same way. If there's any shortfall, it comes out of their own pocket and not from the temple treasury, lest they do it, they would never do it on purpose, but if they made a mistake and came up a little bit short, lest they come to be guilty of this transgression of misappropriating consecrated property, they have to make it up, any shortfall, out of their own pocket. If someone lost their seal, a pilgrim who bought a seal, if he lost it, he had to wait until the evening for these two officials to compare their accounts. If they found a surplus of money equal to the value of the seal he claimed he lost, they would give him libations for the value of the seal. But if not, they would not give him anything. And the name of the day of the week was written on each seal to prevent cheats from acquiring seals when libations are inexpensive and storing them until they increased in value. It's sort of almost like chips in Vegas, right? Poker chips in Vegas. You could take some home with you. You win at roulette. You have a bunch of winnings. You take your chips home with you. Normally people trade them in, but maybe just take some chips home with you, and then when you come back the next day, you got some chips ready to gamble. But in the temple, these seals were always dated, so they were only good for one day. Okay, let's go to your comments and questions. Okay, Steve. Our profession, as in vocation or employ, or the profession of faith. I was talking about that we're striving to conduct ourselves in our professions. I mean our avocation. I mean the work that we do, but we want to conduct ourselves as if we were setting ourselves up to become exemplars of whatever it is we do. In other words, we just want to be righteous, right? And this is why elsewhere in the Talmud it says, right, what is the first question you'll be asked when you appear in heaven? The first two questions. Number one, were you honest in your business dealings? Number two, did you set aside regular times of Torah studies? If you're here learning with us every day, Baruch Hashem, you can answer, yes, I set aside regular times of Torah study. This thing of, were you honest in your business dealings? And what they're really asking you is when no one was looking, when you could make a rounding error in your favor, did you, right? Or did you just conduct yourself as a scrupulously honest person because you knew that heaven sees everything? And why would you behave in front of God in a way that you wouldn't behave if a human was looking over your shoulder? God sees everything. So if you would behave more honestly, if there was a committee watching over you, why would you behave any differently when you're alone, since God is always watching you, right? And so likewise, the same idea as we hear these stories of the officials who were so scrupulous that they were named here in the Talmud, and we're still learning their names and studying how they filled their office, how they fulfilled the duties of their office, that we should aspire to be so meticulous that our names could be recorded. They're not going to be. It's not out of arrogance. We just want to aspire to be that righteous when no one is looking. Jennifer, you are saying we should strive to be our best, clinging to the humility that our best will not be the best? Right. To do our best, exactly. To do our best, knowing that, first of all, there's always going to be room for improvement. Second, let's face it, no, very few of us are ever going to be noticed publicly, even if we do an amazing job, and so maybe, one day we'll be honored at a banquet, or our families will honor us, or our boss will call us in and say, hey, you did a good job. But, so few people are ever honored publicly. But what we're saying is even though you won't be rewarded that way, even though you won't be recognized publicly, conduct yourself as if you're deserving of that honor. Not because what you want is to be honored, but what you want is to be so righteous and scrupulous in your dealings when no one is looking, that you could, be mentioned in the same breath with these people. It's just something to aspire to, right? Not that we're so great at it, but that we're so righteous as we do it. That's what we want to do. Knowing full well that we're often going to make mistakes, we're going to fail, we're going to be selfish, we're going to yell at people, we're going to be bossy, we're going to, we're going to make mistakes no matter what. But, it's like the bar has been set, as it were. And we're just trying to, strive to emulate these elders whose names were recorded in the book. That's the idea. In the same way, that what is the source in the Torah for that we should refine our character, that we should ever strive to be better versions of ourselves. What is the source for that? You shall walk in all his ways. Okay, I'm telling you to emulate these people whose names were recorded 2,000 years ago. But even higher, we should be emulating God. There's no arrogance to that. Obviously, we can never do what God does. We can't be like God. But in the same way that we've learned that God is kind, God is patient, God is slow to anger, these are qualities that we want to strive to embrace and to emulate. Melissa, and I know we're running long, so I'm going to just take a couple more questions. Melissa, would the sages believe that ordinary people who suffer one adversity or tribulation after another are paying for the sins of their fathers or for their actions in past lives? Would this spate of bad luck be considered instead a life lesson? Yes, definitely. Here's the thing. No matter how bad it gets, what gives us comfort is that there's a reason for everything. And so many of the tragedies that happen in this world, you can point to the Holocaust. We can't understand it. We can't understand how whole families, whole populations, children, innocent children, were murdered, were butchered. We can't understand that. I can't give you an explanation that's going to allow us to understand that. But we have faith that there's a reason for it. We can't get it. We don't understand it. But our faith that God runs the world, God is loving, God is kind, God knows everything, sees everything, runs everything, means that God has a purpose for everything. And that we're eternal beings, we're souls, and so we're going to have a chance. We're not going to understand everything that God does, but we're going to be able to look back on our own lives someday. Once we're out of this world, out of this life, we're going to be able to look back on it and understand a little bit at least what God was thinking and why these tribulations befell us. And so that can be a comfort while we're involved in them. That's about all I can say. So for sure, and truthfully, right, I'm sure we can all look back on terrible experiences that we've had, that in the end we're thankful we had them, because if we didn't have them, we wouldn't have learned nearly as much. If we just had a life of comfort, a life of no challenge, a life of everything went great, we'd learn much less. And if all we can really take with us to the next world is what we learn, then it may well be that the people who suffer most are leaving this world with the most wisdom and the most knowledge, the most merit too. And Lynn says, who sponsored our daf today, and we thank you so much for that, Lynn, who comments, what an amazing and important daf. Such a joy to discover it. May all who find this broadcast be also so impressed. Thanks, AT Daily, Baruch Hashem. Thank you, Lynn. I couldn't have said it better myself. That's a perfect place to end the show. Thanks again for sponsoring it. Thanks to everyone who's with us. Look forward to learning with you again tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. We're truly in an exceptional part of the Talmud now. Have a great night.